I live on the shores of Lake Taupo, near the town of Turangi. The view from my house of this great lake is uplifting. Almost every day there are boats on the lake, most of which are either anchored or putting along slowly, obviously fishing. The lake has provided great fishing for years, or at least that is what stories tell us. The trout in our lake, like me, are not native, but are imported, and that is an interesting story in itself. It was a fluke occurrence meeting Toki-doos one day at Kurito that really tweaked my curiosity about fishing in Lake Taupo.
The size on that fish was hanging in that papakainga, we call it. That is not this.
Having suffered a stroke recently, Toki had difficulty telling his story.
Like a stock.
His father-in-law, Kahu Takuru, caught the largest trout ever taken in these waters. The year was 1904. The fish weighed 23.4 kilograms. That's over 50 pounds. Was this just another exaggerated fishing story? Toki's story was soon corroborated by his neighbor, Rex Walker.
Coming into the batch was a guy I came with, and over a doorway was this etching of a big fish, which I believe was a brown trout. It was huge, upwards of 50 pounds.
I also found the catch to have been recorded by Pat Burstall, a former conservator of the Taupo Fishery. The final clincher to this story was finding the original cupboard door with the etching of the trout. Was the story of a 50-pound trout enough to give Lake Taupo and its key spawning tributary, the Tongariro River, the reputation as the best trout fishing in the world? I felt there was a bigger story to be told. Here lies one of the most dedicated and well-known angling legends of the Taupo fishery. Mr. Nielsen began fishing the Tongariro River in 1910. From this year onwards, he could be seen fishing his favorite pools right up to his death in 1957, making him one of the river's most devoted adherents, and one of the very few anglers who would observe the fishery in its two prime periods, pre-World War I and in the early 1920s.
He was a dear old man, was Mr. Nielsen, but he was a very, very snobby Englishman.
How long did he spend here each fishing season?
The whole fishing season, about 6 months.
Each year he would spend 6 months here?
And then the other 6 months he spent at a boarding house in Rotorua.
And so cabin 10, this cabin here would be his...
Yes. He only fished the Tongariro. He'd go into the lounge, read the morning paper, and then go fishing. Oh, he'd fish with different guests who came, but no, he was mostly a loner, I think.
But very dedicated to fishing.
Oh, yes, yes.
Mr. Nielsen has been referred to as the doyen of the Tongariro anglers. If he were alive today, he would have been the ideal person to tell the story of the Taupo fishery. He is not, nor are so many of his fellow anglers who could have helped with this story. I had to rely on books and government documents to fill in the early years, and I hope Mr. Nielsen would approve of my efforts. I dedicate this film to those like Mr. Nielsen who have made the Taupo fishery such an important part of our country's folklore. The beginning of the Taupo fishery can be traced back more than 100 years to the energetic efforts of some early European settlers who formed acclimatization societies. Little did they know at the time the legacy that they would leave the country.
Acclimatization societies were community groups, essentially, that were set up by the early European settlers throughout New Zealand. And their intention was basically to establish plants and animals that they were familiar with from their home country, and predominantly the UK. There were so many different animals that were brought in, game birds like quail, pheasant, rabbits. Trout were introduced into Lake Taupo because the early European settlers saw it as having huge potential. They saw this huge, pristine lake with very, very few native species in it and no large fish. So they set about to introduce species that were of value to them. And the first of those was brown trout, which came in the early 1890s, and they were established in the lake and eventually moved into the rivers as well.
The brown trout had been introduced to the South Island in 1867. The eggs had come from Tasmania and were progeny of English brown trout shipped out in 1864. Eventually eggs were shipped to hatcheries run by acclimatization societies in the North Island. Before long, these societies were tackling the geographic challenge of getting the brown trout into Lake Taupo.
Well, there are various introductions brown trout into Taupo, one of which might be just as believable as the other.
The most popular story gives the nod to Daniel MacDonald, who owned a sheep station called Lochinvar on the road to Napier. In 1887, MacDonald hatched eggs supplied by the Hawke's Bay Acclimatization Society and released tiny trout into all the streams on the eastern side of the lake. There may be a debate over who made the first release, but there is no debate as to their success. By 1898, brown trout were evident and being caught in the lake.
The trout fed on all the small fish in the lake. All the cockabillies were chopped up and the koaro, and so they had a wonderful few years in which they grew and grew and grew.
Although the brown trout successfully took to their new environment, they proved very difficult to catch. According to the Taupo tourist operator, Darby Ryan, the brown trout simply would not take the fly.
Darby Ryan has operated fishing services of various kinds, and there's no point in operating a fishing service if you can't catch one of the big sport fish in the lake.
I can imagine the one thing more frustrating for the early European settlers than a great lake with no sporting fish. And that was a lake full of fish that you can't catch. The acclimatization societies turned their attention to what they thought was a more sporting fish, the rainbow trout.
Rainbow trout, which is the mainstay of today's fishery, and they were brought in by the people from the then Wellington Acclimatisation Society. Malcolm Ross, in particular, brought the first load of rainbow trout fry in from the Masterton Hatchery in 1898. And they were released in the very headwaters of the Tongariro River up in the Waikato stream that flows off Mount Ruapehu.
There weren't very many, and it must have taken some time for them to have percolated down from only a few miles from Mount Ruapehu itself, all the way down to the lake.
The Auckland Acclimatisation Society then really stepped into the scene, and they did follow-up releases of rainbow trout, and right through till about the period 1903-1905 they continued with releases of rainbow trout around the lake.
During this period, Mr. Earle, the president of the Auckland Acclimatisation Society, relied on Darby Ryan to release rainbow trout into the lake.
Darby Ryan was an original All Black. He was a very skilled yachtsman. He was a musician. He was a captain of the ferry boat here that operated between Taupo and Tukanu for some years. Yes, that's the Tongariro, steaming down to Tukanu. Darby was a tourist operator. He hired out boats and he operated fishing camps. And I do know that he was instrumental in bringing thousands and thousands of eggs to Taupo and distributing them aboard his ferry, the Tongariro. In 1904, they were catching trout up to 20 pounds. So within a very, very few years, The trout exceeded all expectations. The growth rate was tremendous.
The Taupo fishery, thus created, was soon known all over New Zealand and indeed all over the world. In spite of its humble beginning, the fishery was destined for world fame. The importance of the fishery as a tourism resource was recognized by the government very early in its existence. Despite controversy and several petitions to Parliament from the acclimatization societies, control was vested into the hands of the Tourist Department in 1907. Although they had very limited resources, the Tourist Department managed the fishery over the ensuing years, until a crisis brought about further government action.
In about 1911, 1912, the fishery started to decline as a result of the boom and bust from a newly established species, and both the condition and the size of fish was dropping significantly.
The government felt more scientific expertise was required to manage the fishery, and as a result, the Internal Affairs Department took charge of the Taupo Fishery from the Tourist Department on June 1, 1913. Control has remained in the hands of this department until 1987, when DOC, the Department of Conservation, was created.
The government brought out a Canadian fisheries expert, Professor Prince, in 1913. He proposed a number of courses of action as well to address the concerns that people had about the state of the fisheries. And I guess it was an indication that the government was taking its role seriously in managing the resource. So the government stepped in then and introduced a program of netting. It was essentially a culling operation. The better quality of those fish were actually processed. They were smoked and railed to markets in Auckland and Wellington, and the great majority of them were buried, went to waste.
The culling operation was successful. By 1920, the fishery had rebounded. The Roaring Twenties would become known as the heyday of the fishery. The quality and size of the catches would become legendary. The Internal Affairs Department carried on their work with the Taupo fishery with the construction of the Tongariro Hatchery in 1928. At the time, the hatchery was considered a critical asset in the management of the fishery.
Hatcheries were crucial to the establishment of trout fisheries and salmon fisheries in New Zealand. There was no way that they could have got through the establishment phase, which in some cases was many years, without actually having hatcheries available to rear trout, to make them available for release into the waters.
Many people thought the purpose of the hatchery was to provide an endless source of trout for Lake Taupo.
As far as the Taupo fishery was concerned, the Tongariro hatchery was really only seen as being a means of supplying fish for stocking in other parts of the country, but also as a means of ensuring that there was some compensation for the eggs that were taken from the wild stock in Lake Taupo to support that operation. And so there were releases of fry back into the tributary streams and into the lake as in compensation for those eggs that were taken out. Today, the hatchery is essentially mothballed. It has no functional part in the management of the fishery, but it is potentially an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff in the event that there is some natural disaster strike the fishery, and most likely would be a volcanic eruption, providing the means to restart the fishery as soon as conditions are suitable again.
Over the years, the government would apply and adjust other strategies in an effort to alleviate the downturns. As a result, the fishery has always rebounded.
Getting towards the late 1920s was a similar situation starting to develop as in 1912, where the trout were starting again to outstrip their food supply. The management response at that time was different. So rather than actually trying to manipulate trout numbers as such, they decided to try and improve the quality of the food supply. And there were a number of things considered, introducing shrimps and various small fish. And eventually they decided on introducing smelt. So in 1933, smelt were brought down from Lake Okaro and introduced into Lake Taupo. The trout population rebounded from the decline that it was going into and really has sustained itself in that way right through until the early 1950s. In the early 1950s. It was a bit of a repeat of what happened during the First World War. Fishing pressure on the lake declined dramatically over the years of the Second World War, as you'd expect in the 1940s, and as a consequence the trout numbers got out of balance with their food supply, and again the condition and quality and size began to decline. And that was really the start of, again, a third different management approach. And this was probably the first one in the history of the fishery management that was really informed by science.
There are things behind the fishery with numbers, with processes, and basically that's the job of the scientists, to try to understand the meaning of these numbers and these processes. I guess that the Holy Grail is really to be able to monitor what you have today in order to predict what you will have in the future. And if the predictions are not so good, then you can take measure now to avoid a disaster further. If it has been a serious flood, for example, we would sample an habitat that has been previously sampled in normal condition and just verify, is there still some fish here or have they been washed away? The drift dive, we do it to have an idea of how many fish have managed to actually avoid being caught by anglers before reaching the spawning grounds, and how many are then there. The data is to provide us with some information, with a trend from one year to the other. On this graph you have the historical variability of the average size of the trout caught in the Taupo. What you see here is that the fishery has been through different ups and downs. Look at the spike in the 1910 and in the 1920s. That's basically the golden years of the fish in Taupo. You can see that soon after the introduction of the trout in Taupo, they very quickly reach an amazing size of about 4 kg in average. But that situation didn't last for very long. It dropped very quickly, and the people at the time, they realized that in fact there was probably not enough food for all these fish, and that was a logical explanation as why the fish were smaller. If you want to understand what happened in '98, because it was affecting mainly the large fish, that is the extraordinary size of the fish that were caught in the lake and in the rivers, you have to return of what happened when they were young. And what happened when they were young was the eruption, the Ruapehu eruption in 1995 and 96. After the eruption, where it was basically barren ground, all the opportunity existed, it has been one particular type of algae that took the opportunity to bloom first. That was a floating
algae, because they didn't have any competition from any other algae. So that species started to bloom at the surface of the lake because it's a buoyant species. Because it's buoyant, the zooplankton that feeds on the periphyton had to go close to the surface as well. Then the smelt that eat the zooplankton, they also had to go close to the surface. So everything was concentrated at the surface of the lake, and the trout basically cashed in big time.
The downturns, of course, they are not so enjoyable to explain, but they teach us a lot about how the fishery works as well. And 2005, 2006 and 2007 are a good example. In 2005, for some climatic current condition in the lake didn't fully mix, which means that a lot of the food that would have been otherwise available to the trophic chain suddenly got cut. This means that the smelt which the trout rely upon were hit very, very hard. If the smelt were hit hard, the trout were hit even harder, because it is like having a paddock. You have a paddock which has no grass but a lot of animal. You can't expect your cow to get big and fat and have a lot of them.
It is this scientific data that provide an indication of what is happening in the fishery, that help guide DOC's policy as to what controls need to be put in place to protect the quality of the fishing. The maximum daily catch, the minimum fish size, and the length of the season have all been adjusted over the years in an attempt to ensure a healthy fishery. As far back as the early 1900s, fishing was bringing tourists to Lake Taupo in ever-increasing numbers. Hotels began cropping up around the small settlement, and to cater for the growing number of anglers, the Taupo tourist entrepreneur, Darby Ryan, leased land from local Maori and set up fishing camps around the lake. His schooners plied the waters, not only offering ferry services, but also catering for the needs of these anglers. In 1904, on the southern end of the lake, an energetic Welshman, Robert Jones, took over the ownership of the Takano Hotel. He quickly established a reputation, not only as a fine hotelier, but as a superb fisherman as well. Jones established a series of camps along the lower reaches of the Tongariro River, the most famous of these being the Delta Camp, situated near the mouth. It would become the haunt of prime ministers, governor-generals, and other foreign dignitaries. The increasing popularity of the fishery would soon create access issues. As a result, the government would step in, and the subsequent legislation passed by Parliament, the Maori Land Amendment and the Maori Claims Adjustment Act of 1926, would be one of the most important acts to affect the Taupo waters, and thus have an impact on anglers. This act was passed as a result of negotiations between the government, represented by the Prime Minister and Native Minister Mr. Coates, and the Ngāti Te Whātoa. Their paramount chief, Honi Taheuheu, signed the document as their representative.
The early settlers wanted to avoid the sort of feudal system that prevailed in the UK in particular at that time, where the sports fish and the game birds were owned by the landowner. And unless you were of the landed gentry, you couldn't get access to those resources. And so there was a very egalitarian perspective, I think, by a lot of the early settlers, that they wanted to make these resources publicly available, that they could not be privatised. Following the netting campaign, there was a big recovery in the quality of the trout fishery, and its fame, I guess, just grew far and wide internationally. Some of those overseas anglers saw an opportunity perhaps to privatise a part of the fishery for themselves by undertaking access arrangements with Maori landowners. So the government entered into negotiations with Ngāti Tuwharetoa, the iwi, to try and protect the access to the fishery for the public in general. And by 1926 they had reached an agreement that said that the title to the bed of Lake Taupo and the beds of the inflowing rivers would pass to the Crown, and that there would be free public access to and use of Lake Taupo, and in addition that there would be a special right-of-way provision on many of the inflowing rivers to allow anglers to pass over Maori land in order to fish those rivers. It was a unique arrangement in New Zealand's history, and to this day is still unique.
The legislation cleared a barrier, the right of access. The Taupo fishery was open to everyone. The Right Honourable Gordon Coates, the Prime Minister, who led the negotiations, was to say that Tuwharetoa people have been very generous in the matter. It was to be the users of the fishery to prove the Prime Minister's words true. The finest trout fishing in the world is to be found at Taupo. However, there was an issue that was disputed by Tuwharetoa that took years to resolve. That was the ownership of the lake bed.
The most interesting part of that act is when the Crown vested itself the Lake of Taupo. And there's just one line there, and it's the smallest line in the whole document, in the whole legislation, and that is that the bed of Lake Taupo will be vested in the King. During negotiations for the 1926 legislation, the bed of Lake Taupo was not on the table. It was in the document, but certainly was not on the table.
And Tuwharetoa were of the view that they had never intended to hand over the title to the beds, but simply to provide for that public and fishing access, both to the lake and to the rivers. And as a result of many years of discussion and negotiation, in 1992, the Crown and the iwi reached an agreement whereby the Crown returned the title to the lake and river beds to Tuwharetoa and to its individual hapu.
The loss of a resource for 67 years is a very, very high opportunity cost that will be very difficult to quantify properly. At the end of the day, there's been losses, wins and losses, but if you did do a balance, certainly Ngāti Tuwharetoa has given a lot to the country.
In 1927, a fortuitous event happened that further enhanced the reputation of the fishery. This was a visit from royalty, the Duke and Duchess of York. While their entourage was settled into the Tucano Hotel, the royal couple enjoyed the solitude of a purpose-built campground beside the Tongariro River at Ko-Fi Flat. Their fishing the Tongariro further established the fishery's international reputation. Partially due to the publicity surrounding the visit of the Duke and Duchess, more rich and famous would make their way to New Zealand to fish our waters. Perhaps the visit of the well-known American author Zane Grey had the biggest impact on our fishery's reputation.
Zane Grey was an absolute passionate fisherman, absolute passionate. Big game fishing was his number one, but trout fishing and probably salmon fishing would have been his second love, I should imagine. Around about 1926-27, Zane Grey came down to Lake Taupo and he fished, and then of course he heard about the Tongariro. Having had a positive experience, he was eager to come back and bring his son with him. He returned in the winter of 1927 with his son, and they camped there and they caught a lot of fish. If the Tongariro wasn't known as the world's number one river, or ranging with the number one rivers in the world before his visit, it was certainly known after his visit.
Taylor's Lodge was originally started by a man called Hatch, and he had it till about 1926, I think. and then Taylor had it to 36. My husband bought the place in 1936, and I came in 1939. There was this place, all that on that side was scrub, and all on this side was scrub, mosquitoes galore. Taupahi Road was the main highway until the power scheme started, and then they changed it. And we had 5 petrol pumps out there. We were the only petrol between Taupo and Waiouru. We'd advertised in fishing books, 25 shillings for dinner, bed and breakfast, and a cut lunch. They came from England and America, all over. Some shocking old snobs from England. You know, retired generals and army officers. And the fishermen, of course, were stirring from about 5 o'clock in the morning at Taylor's Lodge. The most famous pool on the Tongariro, the island pool, was just outside our back gate. So they only had to walk out the gate to fish. We've got a great big iron dinner gong. We'd ring that gong and they could hear it at the river and then come up for their lunch, you see. All came in their waders, of course. And, well, if you didn't let them in their waders so they could go out fishing again straight away, they wouldn't want to stay here, would they? And were they jealous too? And they'd lay their fish out on the lawn out there and come in, you know, how many did you get? And, oh, 2, you know, and they'd all race out of the dining room to look at the fish, and then, oh, where did you get them? Oh, I have my own place. So you're not going to tell the others, otherwise they'll go down and fish his pool. Oh, they were wonderful old days.
Dad got a quarter acre or whatever by the Tongariro Taupo bridge, and he built a fishing lodge. One little wee cabin with a couple of beds, an open fireplace, and we had flush toilets up on the hill for the fishermen, and showers. Fishermen used to come up, say, 2 or 3 days or even a week and have a wonderful time, and have a few spots with Dad. And the fishermen would go out fishing day and night. And Les, my brother, and I had to clean those fish. The fishermen would come up with a boat about 11, 12 o'clock in the morning, and we'd have to get the wheelbarrow, take it right down to the river, Tongariro Taupo River, and the bottom of the boat was just silver with fish. Beautiful fish, any up to 200, 250 or whatever. And we'd cart them back home, back to the smokehouse. It was our job to gut those fish, split them, salt them, hang them, and then smoke them. Dad made his own boats. I helped him to make his boats, wooden boats, of course, and some of them leaked, of course. And it was our job to take the fishermen out for a day with seagull outboard motors and take them out and catch some fish. But it was a wonderful life. We lived off the land, and we were happy. Oh, it was lovely. It was just lovely, yes. We didn't have anything in the way of rods much. We used to make flax lines with a bit of catgut about so long and tie a bare hook on and put a bit of bread on the hook, or even roe. Roe was good. Roe from a hen, that was deadly. Absolutely deadly. And we'd put this bread, it'll float down and the fish will come up, gotcha. We'd pull it in and we'll throw the fish in the blackberry bushes to get them later, because the ranger might come along, you see, so we kept them out of sight. You know what I mean? The ranger's name was Mr. Potts.
Poaching of trout's always been a concern in the fishery. The very fact that it's a covert activity is very difficult. So it's easy to actually seize on that as a cause of any downturn or decline that might be happening in the fishery, and it becomes a fairly emotive topic, which is often not addressed very objectively.
I taught myself how to tie flies, and the rest I learnt just by experience. These ones here we use these at night time, pukaka flies, and these ones here we use in the daytime, except for these ones here with a yellow binding around it, and they're fluorescent. They glow at night time. You shine a light on them, and it retains the light and reflects it, and you can just see them in the water. This little light moving in the water, and the fish go for those. I was out on the boat fishing, and I came into the boat ramp at Kiritau. A man came up to me and he said to me, "Do you remember me?" He said, "You're Tom Grint, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." "Do you remember me?" I said, "No, I'm afraid I don't." "Well, you taught me to tie flies when I was a kiddie." And he was a man now with 2 children of his own.
Since the earliest days of the fishery, there has always been the angler for whom every facet of the sport becomes a challenge. Certainly, this is the case when it comes to fishing equipment. There's more science applied than ever could be imagined, all done simply to deceive trout.
There was no artificial or synthetic fibres in those days, and the lines were all natural silk. They did have some sort of coating on them, but we were given a composition like a type of varnish that periodically we used to rub over the lines, and we had normal cotton backing, but the problem with those lines was that they would deteriorate quite severely, and you had to dry them after you fished every day. If we wanted to use floating lines in those days, no such thing as buying a line like that. You had to impregnate the line with deer fat we used in those days. And of course we used split cane rods. The Green Heart was the early one that learners started on, but the split cane was supposed to be the superior ones of that day, and they were very heavy to use. I could never ever manage casting double-handed, but if you could manage that, you used to get a beautifully long cast.
The disadvantage with cane, of course, was very, very heavy, and if you're fly fishing and you're fishing all day, it's just too tiring. So the evolution of fiberglass, I believe it was in the Second World War, they utilised fiberglass to make fly rods. And that's about when I came on the scene. Fly rods, and we're about half the weight of a bamboo. And of course then came carbon fibre. The technical advantage is, of course, carbon fibre. It is lighter, so therefore you can fish for a lot longer. It's way more sensitive. I mean, you can feel the little nick on the end of the line when a fish is taking, or it's way more responsive when you strike. You have an advantage, and of course people catch more fish.
Love of my life. All my life I fished as a kiddie, as I told you, from my local school in Bayfield. Once I was here in Taupo, I fished every day. When I depart from this world, my ashes will be at the Whareroa, the Kiritau and the Ponsonby Wharf in Herne Bay. Well, I've retired now. Fishing days are over. So I thought I didn't want to lose my hat. So I've now made this trophy for all the boys of the family. will compete. It'll be under the control of the ranger, my grandson here, and I hope it'll bring as much joy as I've had.
I started fishing at the age of 7, and that was 80 years ago next week. I started fishing in New Zealand in 1969. Once I got to Turiangi, I never went anywhere else. Oh, there were good old days and there were bad old days too. I did once catch my limit of 8, but I think I only caught 8 once. But I'd 6 on a number of occasions.
Whoa, look at him jump. Good. Nice jack.
It's a jack, isn't it?
Yep.
When I was younger, I used to enjoy walking to the more distant pools on the Tongariro. Oh, I fished most of the rivers, and the Hinimaiaia is the place to go when the Tongariro is in flood. Well, the Tongariro, I think, must always be the favourite river.
Yes, there we are.
I love the environment. It's one of the great points about fishing in Lake Taupo is the wonderful environment.
Fishing is a time-honored tradition, passed down from generation to generation. Grandparents and parents often share the passion for the sport with their children.
My earliest time on the river was being put on my father's shoulders and walked just to the edge of the river while he fished, and when he got a small one, would pass the rod up to me and let me land it. And as a 4-year-old, that is fantastic.
I became an angler because of my father. My father had been a gamekeeper in Scotland until he moved to New Zealand, and that was really what he lived for, the outdoors and fishing and time on the river, and as children that's what we grew up doing. I've got into it since I discovered this river about 20 years ago, and this river is now a very important part of me.
She was the only woman fishing here, I know. But my mum, she knew everything, where the trout was, you know, up the stream, you can see it up the stream. She knew where the fish was. But my mum, we used to have trout all the time. So we used to live on trout, potatoes, cartwheel bread. Oh, the smell of trout, man. That was awesome, that.
Family's been interested in fishing for quite a number of years. Well, my father, he was a fisherman. He learnt off his uncle, the guy that brought him up here in Turingi. And as a little kid, I used to come down and come out with him here to the delta, and he'll cast my rod out and I'll bring it in slowly. From a long time ago, my father taught me how to feel when your line is actually going straight in the current here. I can have 30 metres of line out and I'll know when just as much as a leaf like that gets caught on my fly because of the different weight difference. So it's things like that gives you a lot of advantage over people that don't do a lot of fishing. A local guy in Taupo, he rang me up in about 1992 and asked me do I want to set my guiding ticket. So I joined with 6 other guys, we're all local guys, and the course took 6 months and it was all paid for by the Tūwharetoa Trust Board. And as soon as I got my licence, I started operating on my dinghy. I didn't have the money to get a bigger boat, so I just used what I had. And, you know, a lot of the guys there sort of rubbish me. Oh, people won't want to come out on your dinghy, but I knew from a long time ago it's not the boat that catches the fish. It's the guy in the boat. I sold my house in Taupo and bought this boat, and basically never looked back since.
I started fishing about 3 years ago. My parents have been a big help because they've taken me and sort of inspired me to be better and get better at fishing. They want me to become a guide, which I really want to do. The thrill of catching a fish and knowing that you've caught it yourself and on your own flies that you've tied, and the adrenaline rush when you hook one. Yeah, I love it. It's great.
I guess what's changed now in terms of the management of the fishery is that the habitat itself is being addressed in much more detail. In the past, much of the effort was directed at the fish themselves and at anglers, the fishing opportunity. Now a lot of the effort is directed at managing the habitat to ensure the water quality of the lake and rivers is sufficiently high to sustain a world-class trout fishery. Because the fishery is a natural self-sustaining fishery and it's not artificially stocked or maintained, then it is very much subject to the effects of changes in habitat quality. And they can be natural, they can be brought about by floods and by climatic cycles and so on. But in particular, they can be brought about by human activity, and there's been a number of things have occurred in the last 50 years in the Taupo catchment which have had an impact on the quality of the fishery. Probably the first of these was the development of agriculture in the catchment. Lake Taupo is particularly vulnerable to that sort of impact because the pumice soils are extremely porous, and so the rainwater that falls on the surface of the land percolates down through the ground and then eventually reaches the lake. And what it does is it takes nutrients with it and carries them through into the lake, which has the effect of enriching the natural nutrient base and causing problems with increased growth of algae and a decline in the quality of water, a decline in its clarity, and the decline in its quality as a trout habitat. One of the problems with dairying is it's not so much the amount of fertiliser that's applied, it's actually the effluent from the stock themselves, and particularly the urine from the cattle leaches nitrogen in, and nitrogen is probably the key nutrient which will lead to a decline in water quality in Lake Taupo. Obviously, the increasing human settlement has had an impact. The original township of Taupo was very small. When I first came here in the 1950s, literally half the streets weren't even paved, they were just pumice tracks. When I first came to Turangi in 1964, there were about 200 people living here. There are now about 2,500, which is down from a peak of about 6,000 during the height of the construction of the Tongariro power scheme. But in addition to the growth of those communities, there have been a number of new settlements established around the lakeshore over that time. In the southwestern shores, Maori, Kuruto, Whareroa, the growth of places like Motuopa, Te Rangiita, Waitahanui and 5 Mile Bay has all had an impact. Obviously, as human settlement increases, then you have issues of water supply, and you have issues of sewage and sewage disposal, and you have issues of stormwater and things like that, which all have the potential to have a negative impact on lake water quality. The other big influence in the catchment has been the establishment of hydroelectric power schemes. Energy has obviously always been very important to the country. From very early times, the hydroelectric potential of the Taupo catchment was recognised. The major hydroelectric scheme, what's known as the Tongariro power scheme, that was massive, even by international standards. From the early 1960s through to the late 1970s, there were major engineering works which involved diverting a number of rivers from outside the natural catchment of Lake Taupo into the catchment, and then diversions within the catchment, focused particularly around the Tongariro River. Those diversions had some major impacts on the quality of the fishery.
A company like Genesis Energy, who believes very strongly that we're here for the long haul, and certainly this power scheme will be relied on for the long haul, we need to ensure that we're responsibly managing our assets. That really involves understanding the impacts that we have on the environment. To do that, we've got to work very closely with our key stakeholders, the Department of Conservation, fishery managers. And within our own priorities, which are about maximising generation from this scheme, ensuring that we maximise those opportunities to work alongside those fishery managers to protect the fisheries and enhance them where we can.
Although the resource consents now in place put restrictions on the minimum flow rates to protect the fishery, there are those who mourn the good old days before the power scheme, when the Tongariro was at full flow. Their feelings invoke nostalgia of what the river used to be.
Oh, it's a ghost of its former self, I'm afraid. The flow is reduced by over a half, and you can cross it more or less at will. In those early days there was a little dinghy that was left on the Major Jones's pool. If you wanted to get across the river, you had to use the dinghy. There's absolutely no way you could have waded across it. It was just so swift. It was the noise of the river. It was called the mighty Tongariro River. And just in normal flow, the sound of the boulders rumbling down the river just in its natural state was really quite awesome. I never had waders in my early days because they were considered dangerous, that a number of people were swept away in the waders, and of course once they filled with water you didn't have much chance.
It was so big and so powerful, you were frightened to take a wrong step because you'd be in the lake, you couldn't stop. It was a great experience. No way would you attempt to walk very far out in the river because the river was too powerful. You'd have to get your leg up against the rock in the river. So you stand there, brace yourself. Power. Relentless power.
What the river used to be would be no more. It was the country's thirst for electric power that would change the mighty Tongariro River forever. However, even with the power scheme, the Taupo fishery has had many fine years, and the fishery scientists are confident that there will be more.
Yes, I think we can very well coexist, and as long as each party shows good faith and want to play the game, I'm pretty sure that we can coexist without problem.
Some of the threats to the well-being of the Taupo fishery we are learning to manage and live with. However, Didimo, a new biological threat that pollutes rivers with a slimy algae, may have more serious consequences.
The problem with Didymo and trout fisheries is threefold, really. Firstly, it affects or can affect the ability of adult trout to spawn in the rivers. Secondly, it can affect the production of the aquatic insects that the young trout rely to feed on. And thirdly, it affects the quality of the angling experience. It is at the moment one of the single biggest threats to the quality and sustainability of the Taupo fishery. As a nation, we often look to somebody else to do something about problems that we face. Didymo is one of those things where clearly no one agency of government, no one community is going to control it or contain it. It is very much the responsibility of individuals, of all water users, whether they be anglers or kayakers or rafters or whatever, but it's individuals' responsibility to take the appropriate measures to check, clean and dry their gear and ensure that it doesn't spread into the North Island. At stake here is the international quality of the trout fishery. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the Taupo fishery has been recognised since its early days of establishment, all through its existence until now, as being an internationally famous fishery because of the sheer quality of opportunity that it provides.
The well-being of the Taupo fishery and the Tongariro River as its major spawning ground has become a concern for other organizations, including Ngāti Tuwharetoa, the owners of the lake and rivers.
The Tuwharetoa Lake Taupo Management Plan is going to be established. That's through discussions with our marae, our hapu, and to see whether we're going on the right track. But one issue that has certainly been highlighted by our people, and that is tikanga, our indigenous mores, so to speak. And that's those are issues that don't identify money, that don't identify development. Those are issues that identify more around the environmental imperative and the protection of water quality. One of the most interesting statements we've had from our hui is that we want our lake, the water within it, to be at a stage where we can drink it without any concern.
This area, and possibly this river in particular, has been such an important part of my life, and it remains that way. And so I feel I need to do something, if I can, which is going to try and keep that river in this environment to be the best at fishing in the world.
Advocates for the Tongariro River isn't a fishing club. It's a society that was established in 2002. Essentially, it's a group of people who are passionate about the Tongariro River and want to give it a voice. The first challenge was to be taken seriously, because unless we had credibility as a group, then we had no effect. We were lucky. We had some very sound individuals with great backgrounds in science and law and general communications and advertising and branding and that sort of thing. So we had the right people, and everybody had a huge passion for this river and a commitment to making sure that we did what we could to look after this river in perpetuity. One of the first successes we had, and probably the most significant one, was that we succeeded in getting a management forum established. In December last year, we reached agreement to proceed with an integrated plan for the whole of the Tongariro catchment. The vision of the advocates is to restore this river to be one of the top 10 trout fisheries, wild trout fisheries in the world.
The goal of another community group was to provide a facility so the youth of the country can develop a respect and an appreciation of what they have and can become good stewards of the resource in the future.
The Lions Club got together with the Internal Affairs Department, who used to run the fishery in those days, and within 18 months had permission and built the underwater viewing chamber at the Trout Centre. Internal Affairs, with help from some fishermen, built the children's fish-out pond. And by 1984, the first kids' fish-outs were being run. And we've now got a classroom built and a full-time teacher there. And this is with the help of Genesis and others. And it's a huge facility. It's wonderful to have the children, the fishermen of tomorrow perhaps, but the children of tomorrow, more importantly, wherever they are in life, having an appreciation of what we have.
I've done this for years to see the enjoyment of the kids, especially a 6-year-old. When they hook that fish, they think they've got gold on the end.
The Taupo fishery is an important part of our heritage. There is a growing national consciousness that it should remain in good health for future generations to enjoy. God never did make a more calm, quiet, innocent recreation than angling. These are the words of Isaac Walton in 1654 from his book, The Complete Angler. Mr. Nielsen, the doyen of the Tongariro River for over 50 years, added this slant to Walton's words. No life is so happy and so pleasant as the life of the angler. Perhaps it is those like Mr. Nielsen, whose dedication to angling, whose love of the environment, and whose appreciation of the solitude and the shared experience exemplify why there is such passion for this sport and why the Taupo fishery is of such value to the nation.